Welcome back, everybody, to the weirdest semester in the world. Today we're going to talk about bone. We have 2 lectures over bone. So our first lecture here, we're going to get into some of the basics, some of the structures. Our second lecture will be a little bit about how bone is remodeled and how it grows. So a lot of vocabulary terms today, and we're going to build off of those vocabulary terms so that we have a better understanding of how bone grows, remodels, changes. But let's always start with the functions of our skeletal system. So you can see a couple of images here. You've learned about this in labs. We have 2 categories of our skeletal system, the axial and the appendicular skeletal system. So what does this system do? It is here to support us. If we did not have our skeletal system, we'd be a big blob of skin and muscle, and really wouldn't be able to move anywhere. Protection, it offers protection, especially when you look at the axial skeleton and our rib cage. It's protecting our internal organs. This system helps us with locomotion and movement. Our muscles act on these bones, and so that's going to offer us this movement to run around and climb and do whatever ninja competitions you're going to sign up for, or Tough Mudders you're signing up for. It's a storage facility for minerals like calcium. It also helps balance our electrolytes, so calcium and phosphates. It can act as an acid-base buffer again. We've seen this before with some of our other systems. And it helps with blood cell formation. So we call that process hematopoiesis. Now, some of the learning outcomes we're going to look at first is to discuss the function of the skeletal system, which we did, and then classify different types of bones. Now, just a few more definitions as we move on. So osteology is the study of bone. Osteo is bone. And orthopedic doctors, maybe some of you are interested in pursuing this degree or this career path, look at bones, joints, ligaments, and tendons. So basically they're studying the entire system. So when we talk about building and interconnecting systems together, in order to study those bones and those joints and those ligaments, right, we really need to look at this as a whole. Now, the skeletal system is composed of bone, but also cartilage and ligaments. Ligaments are holding bone to bone here, and that's what's going to form those really tight articulations that you've probably been looking at with your online labs. It's a really strong framework, and we'll be looking a little bit closer at cartilage. How is that involved with our system? We're mostly going to be focusing on hyaline cartilage. Now, to clarify, ligaments are holding bones to bone at joints, and tendons are going to attach muscle to bone. Quick question, do you remember what kind of tissue tendons and ligaments are? Dense, regular connective tissue. Great. Now, you'll be seeing a lot of these images in lab as far as muscles and their connection points. Now, you spent a lot of time learning all those little features on bones, trochanters and tuberosities. These are locations that tendons are attaching to. Tendons for these different muscles that you're learning about and you're going to identify. So we're really trying to wrap all that together. We're going to talk about how those muscles create forces on the bones and actually help build stronger and bigger trochanters and tuberosities, how that works with bone formation and remodeling, and then eventually we'll talk about the muscular system here in lecture. Now, here's just a close-up of the tibiofemoral joint, otherwise your knee joint. So looking at these different ligaments that are here holding our bones in place. So we've got our lateral collateral ligament. We've got that lateral meniscus. Remember, that's going to offer cushioning between these 2 bones, the femur and the tibia, so that it's not bone-on-bone grinding. We have our PCL, our posterior cruciate ligament. We've got our anterior cruciate ligament, our ACL. These are going to withstand stress from an anterior and a posterior direction, while our medial collateral ligament and our lateral collateral ligament are there to kind of resist in a lateral and medial motion. Again, if you are playing football or soccer, a lot of times you have some pretty good knee injuries. Skiing is a pretty good knee injury. Twist it in a way that it's not supposed to be twisted, and this is made up of that dense regular connective tissue. So the fibers are parallel in that kind of wavy motion, and they can withstand tension in one direction, but not from a side. So when there's tension away from the joint on the femur and down on the tibia, they're really, really strong. And then again over here you can see that medial meniscus sitting underneath that medial condyle. Some of you maybe have had some meniscal tears, and those may or may not have been fixed depending on how bad they are. But just to get a little bit more familiar with your knee joint, I think a lot of us tend to have these kinds of injuries, and so we can kind of unite over knee injuries. I don't have any knee injuries, luckily. I just have like bulging discs in my back, and that's horrible. So don't ever do that. Bend your knees when you pick things up. Now we'll come back to this, but we're going to look at some pathologies. So we'll talk about rickets and Paget's disease and osteoporosis. But again, we will be trying to apply some of the content that we're learning now into these pathologies, just like we have been with all of our lectures. Now, to point out our cartilages, we said that cartilage is involved in this system. So here are our bones of the skeleton. In the darker brown, we can see our axial skeleton. So our vertebrae, our sacrum, our ribs, our skull, right? And then our appendicular skeleton is coming off of that. So generally our arms and our legs. The cartilage, is you can see locations of hyaline cartilage in blue. So here connecting our ribs to our sternum, we can see those at the ends of our long bones, and up here in the nose or over here in the thyroid and trachea, keeping those airways open. Elastic cartilages, we can see that up here in the ear, and then our fibrocartilages here at that pubic symphysis and those intervertebral discs. Really strong, a lot more cartilage, so it's much less flexible. Now, that skeletal cartilage does not have blood vessels. We mentioned this a couple of lectures ago, but it is made of that. It does have that dense connective tissue surrounding it called the perichondrium. So remember, peri is around or near, and chondrium, or it comes from cartilage. So perichondrium is around the cartilage, and that's where the blood vessels are, and so it relies on the diffusion of nutrients up into the cartilage, so it takes a lot longer for cartilages to heal. Now, just a quick refresher, you can see up here we have our hyaline cartilage. It's just a drawing, little cartoon drawing illustration of what we're looking at. We've got our perichondrium right here. We have our chondrocytes inside of our lacunae, and we have this extracellular kind of glassy matrix with some of those collagen fibers dispersed throughout there. With our fibrocartilage, we have lots of collagen fibers in there, big bundles of collagen fibers, and again, chondrocytes within those lacunae. And then in our elastic cartilage, again, we see those elastic fibers that are going to offer us flexibility, like we have in our ears, again, immersed in that kind of glassy matrix. But again, we see those elastic fibers really kind of pronounced in that tissue. And then our chondrocytes sitting within those lacunae. You'll notice this term chondroblasts. The chondroblasts will give rise to the chondrocytes, and we're going to talk about that, especially with bone development. We'll see osteoblasts and osteocytes. Now, some of you, if there's wrestlers in here, have probably run into this, but this can be a common sports injury where we damage the blood vessels of that perichondrium, and so we get this swelling and buildup of fluid in the cartilage. So this is something called cauliflower ear. You can have it drained. You can have a little bit of surgery or antibiotics. Sometimes that will bring it down. Time will also bring it down, but it can be really, really painful. All right, so now we're going to classify our bones. This is something you've seen in labs by now. We have 4 or 5 different types of bones, we can say. So we have our long bones, which are longer than they are short. So our humerus, our femur, our fibula, radius ulna, our metacarpals, metatarsals, right? These are our long bones. Short bones, then, you can look at, these would be in our ankles or in our wrists. So they are about as wide as they are long. Sesamoid bones, then, you don't see in here, but sesamoid bones act as little pulleys. They're small little bones. So our kneecap would be a sesamoid bone. We find these within tendons. And I thought this was just a really cool image. You don't need to spend any time memorizing all of these or any of the numbers or anything. What I think is just cool is that we kind of always hear, oh, the kneecap is a sesamoid bone. But look at all these other sesamoid bones that exist within our bodies during our time on Earth. So anyways, just kind of thought it was a cool image to show you. And then we have flat bones. Flat bones would be like our skull and our sternum. And then we have just irregular, everything else that doesn't really fit in there. So our vertebrae are a really great example of an irregular bone. Okay, so there we go. That was pretty quick and easy, right? Now let's get into the larger overall anatomy of our bone. And we're going to look at these macroscopic organization of bone and how our bones are constructed. If you remember back to our connective tissue lecture, we talked about bone is a connective tissue, and we have 2 types of bone. Compact bone, which you can see here highlighted in red, and we have spongy bone, which we'll get into here in a little bit. Now that compact bone is really thick and dense and strong, and we tend to have lots of this compact bone on the outside because it's going to resist that compression. It's really strong, and it's going to give us a lot of support. That compact bone, we see a large prevalence of compact bone right here in the shaft of these long bones, and we call the shaft of these long bones the diaphysis. The diaphysis, and that's our shaft here. Inside of the diaphysis, in living bone, so note this left image here is living bone, while the one on the right is dried up dead bone. So over here we can see that we have a marrow cavity with yellow bone marrow inside and lots of blood vessels that are innervating into our, or that are going into our yellow marrow. In the epiphyses, we'll see the end of the bones, the ends of these long bones. We see that we have a prevalence of red bone marrow. Okay, and up in here, we also have, oops, I'm going to back up. We also have our spongy bone. I'll talk a little bit about that. You can see that right in here. Now, what is the difference? When you look at red marrow and yellow marrow, when we are very young, our bones are full of red marrow. As we age, what ends up happening is that red marrow starts to change into yellow marrow. So pause your video and think about why that might happen. What would be the benefit of having red marrow as a child and yellow marrow as an adult? Let's talk about this for a little bit and think about this logically, right? Infants, they're just born. They have a lot of red marrow. They are growing at a rapid pace. They have a giant need for oxygen and nutrients, correct? So the red marrow is responsible for producing a lot of our red blood cells and most of our white blood cells, because again, our infants are young, they haven't been exposed to a lot of pathogens, and so their immune system is also developing. So they need to be cranking out these red blood cells and these white blood cells. As we age, then we don't need as much of that production of our immune cells or our red blood cells. And so our yellow marrow is actually where we start to store fat, and we also kind of have some white blood cell development as well. All right. By the time we're 20 or older, kind of most of you in this class right now, your bones are mostly made up of yellow marrow. Now, during severe blood loss, our bodies are actually capable of converting yellow marrow back into red marrow to help ramp up hematopoiesis, or the formation of blood cells. Some cancers you may have heard, if you remember when we were talking about multipotent and oligopotent stem cells, and we used bone marrow as an example. If we have cancer of those stem cells, that can lead to different types of leukemias. Now here's just another image highlighting or comparing and contrasting an infant with an adult, and you can see that the infant is pretty much all red marrow. As we get into 25 and older, as we become an adult, our long bones are pretty much all yellow marrow, while our flat bones are made mostly of red marrow. So again, that hematopoietic tissue, that red marrow, we see some cavities in adults in the heads of the femur, humerus, and in the diploe of flat bones, and we'll talk about what diploe is. Red marrow of the newborns and infants, they are in all of those spongy bone areas. Now we talked about the epiphysis. These are the ends of the long bones. This is where we see articulations with other bones and the formation of our joints that are surrounded by those synovial capsules, the connective tissue capsules, really strong capsules around there that are filled with synovial fluid. So now we're talking about a meniscus. We have hyaline cartilage around the ends of our long bones, a meniscus in some of these joints. We have synovial fluid around that, so we're really trying to lubricate these joints. And again, you can see that spongy bone down there looks much more different. Looks much different than that compact bone. And if we look really close, that spongy bone is composed of these trabeculae, or beams of bone. Okay. Now we're looking a little bit closer here, so we're taking this cross section through this long bone right over here, and I'll put in my laser pointer, and I guess popped up red, so we're going with red. So we've taken a little cross section here, and now what we want to do is look a little bit more closely at what our compact bone and our spongy bone looks like. So we can see that our spongy bone is made of those trabeculae, those beams, and we can see nerves and blood vessels weaving in and out of those trabeculae. Now what we're going to look at here is something called an osteon, and you've learned about this in labs already, and we're going to get a little more familiar with that here. When we talk about short bones, irregular bones, and flat bones, we see that they have a periosteum covering the compact bone on the outside. So remember, we talked about a perichondrium before, so now we're talking about periosteum, so connective tissue lining the outside of that bone. We have endosteum on the inside of that compact bone, and then we have spongy bone right inside. So we kind of have this like bone sandwich here, where our compact bone is our bread and our spongy bone is the, whatever you like to put inside of your sandwiches. And then we have bone marrow in between all of those little trabeculae here, and that's where our blood cells are going to be formed, is within that red marrow. Now, we mentioned this before. We have articular cartilage over the epiphyses, where we have joints articulating to reduce friction. And then you'll also see these little nutrient foramina. These are where blood vessels go inside of our bone to take in blood, or take in oxygen, take out carbon dioxide. And then in this image, we can see on our living bone that outer connective tissue periosteum that's vascularized right here. So what does that look like? Well, there's two layers to this periosteum. We have an outer fibrous layer, and that's our dense irregular connective tissue. So remember, the fibers are moving in all different directions, so it can withstand stress in all different directions. Within there, we see nerve fibers, blood and lymph vessels, and those are going to enter into the bone through these perforating canals. That irregular connective tissue is anchored to the bone or to the compact bone by these perforating fibers. And then inside of that, the deeper layer, we have this osteogenic layer, and this is where we see bone stem cells that are becoming osteoblasts, or we can also call them progenitor cells. So we'll look at that in a little bit. Now here, back to this image, we can see where the endosteum would be in our cavity here, and so that endosteum would be along the inside. Again, the periosteum outside and around the bone. And then last we have our epiphyseal line right in here. Now there's two terms, epiphyseal plate and epiphyseal line. You're going to confuse them until you really get this down a little bit. The growth plate or epiphyseal plate is made of hyaline cartilage, and up until we become an adult and stop growing, those epiphyseal plates are getting longer and growing with our bone here. An epiphyseal line is when that plate becomes ossified. It's totally bone, it's totally made of bone, but it's this remnant, almost like a scar, if you will, that just kind of remains here in the ends of the bones in those epiphyses. All right, now let's take a little bit of a closer look at bone and look through the lens of a microscope. To start off, we need to understand the four major cells that are involved with bone. Bone construction, bone deconstruction. So bone, if you remember, is a connective tissue, and it is made up of cells and fibers and a background matrix. So our first cell type we have here are the osteogenic cells. These are our stem cells, and they're going to give rise to osteoblasts. Now, osteoblasts build bone, so blast for building bone. You'll notice they are kind of columnar in shape. They've got a nucleus down in here. We can see their organelles inside. And those osteoblasts, as they are taking nutrients from the blood, you can think of them as like taking cinder blocks and building up our bone. And so what happens is, as they're depositing this bone material around themselves, they eventually build the bone and they trap themselves within the bone. Now we can call them osteocytes. They're located within the bone matrix. They don't migrate around, and they just kind of make sure things are good around them and kind of maintain the health of that bone matrix. So they get trapped within those lacunae, or the little structure that they just built them, which is why when you think back to chondrocytes and osteocytes, you always see them sitting inside of those lacunae. So that's like their little house or their little apartment. The last cell we have is our osteoclast, and osteoclasts cut bone or chisel away at bone. You can think of the C's, right? So they are going to take the nutrients from the bone and put those back into circulation. Now you'll notice here that these cells have lots of nuclei in them, and they also have this ruffled edge right down here. So let's go ahead and pause your video right now, look at these 4 questions, and think about osteoclasts and try to apply some of our previous knowledge into these 4 questions. So how'd you do? Number 1, why would an osteoclast have multiple nuclei? Well, if you think back to what we talked about with skeletal muscle, we need to have a lot more genetic coding so that we can produce a lot more substances. Osteoclasts are going to need to produce a lot more product because they are responsible for breaking down bone, so they're going to have to produce more enzymes. How would an osteoclast release those digestive enzymes? Well, if they're being produced inside the cell, they're being released through lysosomes to the cell surface and being secreted onto the bone to digest that bone. Osteoclasts also pump out hydrogen ions, so why would you pump out hydrogen ions if you're an osteoclast? Well, if we think about pH, hydrogen ions are going to help make an acidic environment to help eat away and chisel away at that bone when they need to cut away at that bone. And then number 4, what's the functionality of the ruffled plasma membrane? Hopefully you saw that and you're instantly like, aha, increased surface area. So definitely. All right, now let's talk a little bit about the matrix of bone. Anybody fans of the Matrix? That was like my era growing up. So it was like the most amazing thing in the world at that time of the year. So anyways, the matrix of bone tissue, it's about 1/3 organic and 2/3 inorganic. The organic matter is produced by those osteoblasts. So these bone cells are going to be producing osteoid. So when we talk about organic matter, we can't include the bone cells, but then the product being released by those osteoblasts. So osteoid is collagen and carbohydrate protein complexes that are being deposited. And then our inorganic matter is about 85% hydroxyapatite, basically minerals, crystallized calcium phosphate salts that, if you remember, we talked about vitamin D and calcium in the integumentary system. Here we're going to see how those play a role in the development of bone. And then about 10% calcium carbonate, and then other minerals, about 5% other minerals, so fluoride and sodium, potassium, magnesium. If we look at the composition of bone, we can see that it is really, really good at resisting compression and tension. So if we look at the organic component of bone, it's about half as strong as steel in resisting compression. So in this image over here, when we build these giant skyscrapers and student housing complexes around NAU, we see a lot of cement, and within that cement is rebar, and so that cement is going to resist compression. That rebar is in there to help resist any tension and twisting motions, so it's creating this really super strong structure. When we look at bone, again, our inorganic is about half as strong as steel in resisting compressional forces, and the organic components are as strong as steel in resisting tension, right? So pretty strong stuff when we talk about our framework. Now, we've seen the osteon before, and this is our structural unit of bone. So inside of the osteon is this hollow tube that we call a central canal. And let me pull this laser up here. So we can see one whole osteon right here, and within the middle of that is our central canal. Inside of the central canal, we see that we have arteries and veins and nerve fibers. And these need to bring in nutrients and take out wastes and feed all of those osteocytes that are stuck within those lacunae. Now, these osteons are composed of layers called lamellae, and these layers of bone are kind of like tree rings that you can see up here in the top right. What you'll also notice is that within those lamellae are collagen fibers, and those collagen fibers run in opposite directions with each lamellae. And what that's doing is helping reduce that twisting force on our bones, right? And we're going to talk about twisting fractures later, but that's, again, we can resist compression, we can resist compression, but we also need to be able to resist a twisting motion in our bone. So these collagen fibers, the inorganic and the organic matter, all help resist those forces to create this really, really strong framework inside of our bodies. Now, moving in a little bit closer, we can see that we have our central canals. So here's, let's back up over here. Here's our cross section. So we're building on that image that we saw previously. And so we can see that we've got our osteons that are making up bone. Within those osteons, we have our central canals, and then in between those central canals, we have what's called perforating canals. And those perforating canals go between those osteons so that those blood vessels create a nice little road work in between the entire bone, which ultimately come out of that spongy bone and that canal, and then eventually out through those nutrient foramina and into circulation. So we've got this nice road work of our circulatory system, feeding all of these little osteocytes that are stuck inside their lacunae. Now, if we look a little bit closer, here's our central canal, and then we have our lamellae around that. And what we can see then are these little black dots. These are the lacunae, and this is where those osteocytes are residing. Now, between those, we need those osteocytes to be able to communicate with each other. So we have these little passageways called canaliculi. Canaliculi. Say that over and over again. That one's a tough one. But this is going to allow nutrients and wastes to diffuse from an osteocyte to another osteocyte to another osteocyte and out through that central canal. And it also allows those osteocytes to communicate with each other. So again, let's review and reinforce. Look at these questions, get some answers, and we'll see you in a couple minutes. Okay, so that brings us to the end of today's lecture. We've looked at the macro and microscopic views of bone. We've looked at the organization. We've learned a lot of terms. So before next lecture, spend some time making some flashcards, review these terminologies that we just went over, and then next lecture we'll be looking at how bone grows, how it's remodeled, how it's healed. So some really cool information where we're going to apply a lot of what we learned today to situations. So make sure you have a good understanding before you watch next lecture, and I'll see you virtually on our review session. Have a great afternoon.